There's a whole bunch. I'm sharing. They're all filled by me.
How are you? Good. How are you?
Welcome to this Grant County Council special joint council meeting with the City Council and the County Council. The time is 5:31 and we'll call this meeting to order. Present is City Council Member Caleb Jones, County Council Member Patrick Trim, Ray Halliday, Lori Paxton, Curtis Wells, Mayor Emily Niehaus, Mary McGann, County Council Chair. We have Diana Carroll, Third Auditor, Ruth Dillon, County Administrator, David Nickert, City Administrator. We have Mike Duncan, City Council, Ronnie Gerardstreet, City Council, and Karen Newton, City Council, and Jaylynn Hawks, County Council. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We do have our first item up is the update on prevention and cleanup plan to a recent fire. We have some people here who are key players. What I would like to do for this portion of the agenda is to have the stakeholders, the people who were at the meeting on Monday morning, to stand up, introduce yourself. We can start off, we'll start with Rick. Stand up, introduce yourself, tell what your role is and what you will be doing. And then anybody that's not here, I'll give a brief update of what their role is, and then we will move to the next agenda item.
Rick Baby, Emergency Manager with the Sheriff's Office.
I'm Angela Crowther, Utah Division of Emergency Management.
Rick, do you want to tell us what your role is and what you're going to move forward with?
Whatever comes up.
Okay.
Sorry, regional liaison, so Southeast Utah and Eastern Utah. I support my local emergency managers doing their regular planning, every day-to-day stuff, grants, and also if they have a disaster, they need support. So our also administers and manages some grants and emergency funds.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm Chris Robert. I work in emergency management for Rick, and I'm helping coordinate different elements of the operation.
She is very much doing an understatement here. She is instrumental in so many levels of this process, from helping people who were devastated by this disaster and also helping with the coordination of volunteers and the coordination of the workers. I mean, she's being very thoughtful on what she's doing. Bill?
Bill Mosier, I'm Fire Chief. I'm assisting with mitigation and stuff like that around the fire burn area and assisting any other needs while they're in the cleanup process.
And once again, he's being very thoughtful. The state said this was one of the best managed and run disaster fire areas they have ever been to. And it was well managed.
Our firefighters are awesome.
Daryl Lincoln, Sheriff's Office. We started with traffic control, I think, from the front. It's fluid, I'm not sure what we're doing, where we're going, whether it's making sure things are happening, traffic, but we're there, just trying to coordinate.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to the Sheriff's Department. Thank you. I see people over here. Where's, Tara. Okay.
Cara Darwin with Run Room Restoration. I'm helping organize and coordinate different vegetation concerns, particularly in the creek and riparian areas.
And you met yesterday, correct?
I was at the meeting yesterday morning.
But have you already met with some people?
I've been making phone calls, drafting a few things up, and lots of coordination emails. There's been, Jake Delorius from Utah Conservation Corps, which is a portion of USU, has been working with the Utah Watershed Restoration Initiative to have some funds reallocated that will help pay for some UCC crews with some match from the city and also from the school district, so that some critical areas can be addressed immediately with soft crews as opposed to volunteers. So that's the main thing I've been working on right now. And then this plan that anyone who is interested that has input on this, whether it's fire department, sheriff, Maud Police Department, anybody, this is meant to be about what the entire community views in terms of critical places to deal with fire fuels and just create some strategies so we can do it in an organized way.
And Carter was willing to step up and play a volunteer to be the key coordinator for the mitigation and prevention. So I very much appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Craig Sanchez, Grant County Office of Emergency Management, Public Information Officer. Just disseminate information both during the event and post. Got our Facebook page, Cinecourt Fire Coordination is where we're distributing all the official news as we get it.
It's been, how many hits have you gotten?
Yeah, Samantha Bonsack manages that. She's done a tremendous job, and yeah, it's been very exciting to see the feedback and the participation in that.
Steve, is there anybody that I've missed that is part of the mitigation of stakeholder group? Myself and Emily Niehaus and Curtis Wells, we have been working, and our goal as elected officials is to support people who are doing the work, and wherever we can do that, we will step up and help us to make sure that happens. Jeff Whitney has been working very much. He has done some clarification on committing and how we can get machinery down into the creek. He's done that, and he is working on the floodplain maps and helping people know what, how, and they can rebuild their structures from the possibility of rebuilding homes. Many of you have probably heard that things are slowed down because of the concern of asbestos. That we had air quality control come in last weekend, and they have taken samples from every area that has been burned. We're hoping to have the results from that analysis tomorrow, and then they will help us develop a plan as to how to mitigate if there is asbestos on the site. My prayer is there is not, but if I was going to Las Vegas, I would bet there was, just because of the age of the structures that were burned. So it's been frustrating to the people, homeowners, the property owners, because they are anxious to get in there and clean up, but yet our job is to protect them and to protect the safety of everyone. So that's slowed everything down. I'm looking through to see if there's any other things that the Monument Waste has generously offered to move and help with the cleanup by getting equipment over there, and also where the Bryan County Solid Waste District and Monument Waste are going to work very hard not to at least do as much as they can free, and where that becomes a burden to just charge what needs to be charged to keep from going bankrupt in a sense. So that's very nice of both of those organizations. We'll have it posted what volunteers and how volunteers, it's lots of people want to volunteer. We are asking the in-kind donations, not to bring in-kind donations because of storage right now. There's no place to put the storage, and most people are just, not in their homes, so they can't store them. But gift cards and cash donations are very much welcome. Jared West, who is working on getting the metal and iron moved from the area. Wabi Sabi and Desert Industries working very closely with us. Can you think of anything against from the meeting? Anyone? Is there something I should report from the stakeholders meeting? I am.
It's Cinnamon Court Fire Coordination, is that right? That's where all of the communication we want to have happen at one place, so that's what Greg was talking about. Cinnamon Court Fire Coordination on Facebook. Yes.
So I can't express how amazing it was to be in that meeting on Monday morning and see our professionals and our volunteers step up to the plate to help in such a dramatic way. So all stakeholders that are here, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And people that aren't here, thank you. Thank you.
Can I make one
You?
announcement here?
Yes.
Most of the stuff you're seeing is, you won't see, it's done behind by the volunteers and staff people. But they're busy and they're looking for all kinds of resources. But I would ask the media and the members of the community to be a little kind tomorrow. We're expecting the beginning results of the asbestos tests tomorrow afternoon. Our intent is to get the families together that have been impacted with some counselors and to break that news to them, whatever that may be. We are anticipating it's probably not going to be great news for some. Some don't have any insurance. So I would just ask you to let us do that as individually we can, as privately as we can. It's a very somber thing to lose your home. And we will get you the information at the appropriate time for that. Realistically, these people need a little time to take in what we're going to do and to make some decisions on what they're going to do with the rest of their lives. So be patient with us. We'll get you the information as soon as those owners know what the results are going to be. Thank you.
And it will be expensive. It will be very expensive. So not only will we probably going to the community asking as we have for donations for the people who have lost their homes, we will probably also ask for donations to help with the funding to get them out.
And I think the count is somebody 20,000? 25,000 in actual cash that's been donated so far to the residents.
Generous.
The businesses and members of the community are stepping forward. And it's very rewarding to see that. Some of them are going to need a lot more help than others. But we're going to work with them. And like I say, you won't see a lot of us out front, but we will be helping those people as we can.
Anything further?
Thank you.
We will now go to the presentation of phase 2 of the Assured Housing Study of Matt Kota, is that how you say it? And Zachariah.
Ruth, do you mind doing the middle one as well? If that's not too much for folks. Okay, so I don't intend to present anything today. I am available for questions following Matt's presentation, but I wanted to just provide a very brief introduction for Mr. Matt Cota. He is the principal of BAE Urban Economics, which is the consultant we selected to conduct our assured housing economics studies. So phase one was the feasibility study. I presented that to the results of that study to the city and the county councils a couple of months ago. Based on the findings of the phase one study, we proceeded to phase two, which is the nexus analysis. While you have received the report in the packets and then also directly via email, you haven't had an in-person presentation of that study yet. So that's the initial objective for today, but of course the much larger objective is to take the results of both phases of the study in the context of this conversation about an assured housing policy. And the goal for today is to get you more information and to give you an opportunity to ask questions from Matt and to the degree necessary of me, and to make sure that you're prepared to go forward in your own policy discussions, meaning your own city council discussion and county council discussion. So Matt has been great to work with, a very professional firm. They've got a tremendous amount of experience across the country in cities as small as, well, smaller than ours certainly, and as large as New York City. So it's really been a pleasure to work with Matt and his team. I've learned a lot from them, and I appreciate you coming out today. And with that said, I'll let you take it from here.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, Zachariah. Good evening, Madam Mayor, Madam Chair, and members of the two councils. It is a pleasure to be here today to present the results of the analysis. I think you had about 20 minutes on the agenda for this item, so I'm going to move through pretty quickly. We'll do a recap of the phase one analysis and then jump into the phase two. I'll try to just move right through it, but then if you have questions afterward, as Zachariah mentioned, both he and I will try to answer your questions for you. So with that, a two-phase project, as he mentioned. Phase one included a lot of background analysis to establish the affordable housing needs and also the financial feasibility assessment to look at which kinds of development projects could actually afford to take on a burden of some additional affordable housing requirements. And I'll recap that in just a moment. Phase two analysis is the nexus analysis, where we identify the amount of affordable housing demand generated by new market rate commercial and residential development, estimate the maximum justifiable fees on the basis of that nexus, and then look at a comparison of what's feasible and what's justifiable to pick out what we would recommend as the maximum fee amounts that you consider charging for your new development projects. So moving on to phase one summary. The demographic and economic analysis, a couple of the high points there were that the resident population, the tourism industry have really grown a lot. Job growth has been primarily in lower paid positions. So you're starting to see the makings of some affordable housing challenges with that. Home prices have increased substantially, outpacing income growth and having impacts on affordability. Low-income households, and those are households at or below 80% of the area median income, and also some moderate income households and those with lower incomes than that are going to have a hard time affording market rate rents within this community. On the non-residential side, the lodging industry has really been expanding rapidly. Your associated visitor-serving sectors, so the restaurant and retail and so forth. The actual just kind of classic retailing, grocery stores and so forth, as well as the office growth, has not been as robust in the same time period. So in the feasibility analysis, what we're looking at again is whether it's feasible for new development projects to incorporate some additional cost related to complying with assured housing requirements or affordable housing requirements. So we looked at some prototype developments in office, retail, and hotel development, and analyze under current market conditions, is it feasible to build those projects? In our estimation, the feasibility isn't there for office or retail, but the hotel project is feasible. We then tested the amount of fee, some sort of range of fees, and evaluate whether it would be financially feasible for those projects to incorporate those costs. And what we saw was in that hotel at a fee between $5 and $15 per square foot, that would still be feasible and allow a hotel developer to achieve an acceptable market rate of return. For the residential analysis, we looked at several different types of residential developments: apartments, condominiums with overnight rentals, townhouses with overnight rentals, and single-family detached homes. And what we found there was that an apartment project that's strictly intended for permanent residence is not going to be able to be feasible under current conditions. We think that's related to competition for land, for sites where you can build apartments with other more profitable uses such as hotels or overnight condominiums and so forth. The overnight rentals, we estimated, could support a fee level of around $5 per square foot. We tested $4 to $8 per square foot for the townhome. It's an overnight rental, and that is feasible at that level. And then single-family detached units, only for those that are more of a build-to-suit type of a development that's not sold through a broker, but more of a custom home scenario, estimating around $1 per square foot was feasible for that type of a project. So going into the phase 2 analysis, what we do is we took those development prototypes that appeared to have the financial capability to support assured housing fees. We did some additional analysis on that nexus. What is the actual amount of affordable housing demand associated with those kinds of projects? And so we took the hotel project on the commercial side, and we took several of the residential prototypes on the residential side and analyzed those. So really quick on the process of doing the nexus analysis. On the commercial side, first thing we're doing is looking at the employment density in the project, how many total jobs. Then we're estimating the worker households by income level. So recognizing that not every worker needs a new housing unit, but you typically have multiple workers per household. We're estimating the income levels based on some very detailed census data that we can look at for the county area, and estimating their household income level, looking at the affordable housing financing gap. So based on the household income levels, what they can afford to pay, and what the cost to build the housing is, we have an affordable housing gap for certain income levels, and I'll detail that in a moment. That lets us calculate what the maximum justifiable fee is, and then we're going to compare that to the maximum feasible fees that we identified. So running through it for the hotel development, what we see is about, let me point to this for you. There we go. So right in here, the very extremely low, very low, and moderate, that's the number of new households at those income levels that we estimate associated with a 80-room hotel project. And next, we calculate that affordability gap. And in the analysis, we're using a prototype of a 2-person or 3-person household in a 2-bedroom unit, affordable at these various income levels. Our estimated cost to develop the unit is $172,000, so it's the same across all the income levels, just the cost to develop it. The supportable mortgage is the amount of mortgage that could be supported based on the net operating income from the affordable rents for those. So you can see that as the income level goes up, the supportable mortgage goes up, and then you have the financing gap that remains. And so as the income goes up, that goes down. This is hopefully intuitive in the sense that the higher the income level, the closer to market rate, the closer they can come to covering those project costs, and then vice versa as you go down to the lower income levels. So at those levels, so you can see that total affordable housing need 12.79 units for that 80-room project. The financing gap added up across all those income levels was $934,000, and we estimated the maximum impact fee that could be, justified was $15.57 per square foot. Then we compare the maximum justifiable with the maximum feasible fee, not wanting to have a fee that exceeds the lower of the two, and so we're recommending here that the hotel fee not be higher than the $15.57 per square foot. The maximum feasible fee, we calculated that out at a level at how high could you push that and still allow the hotel to achieve its targeted yield on cost. Here's an example, just a summary for the hotel, how that works in terms of the impact on profitability. If you add in the estimated fee at $15 per square foot, so under the baseline, we're estimating a yield on cost here of 9.8%. If you add in a $15 per square foot fee, then that drops that yield on cost down to 9.2% per square foot. I'm sorry, 9.2% yield on cost. So that's the net operating income divided by the development cost. So this would be feasible at that level. Moving on to the residential nexus analysis, it's a similar process, but there's a little bit more involved in this, where instead of looking at the direct employment that's supported, we're looking at the employment that's supported by the household expenditures of those new market rate households that are coming into the market rate unit. So first we estimate the incomes in the new households, then we look at their, and this is based on what it would cost to qualify for a housing unit. Then we look at their household spending pattern, what industries are they spending their household discretionary income on, and in turn, what kind of new worker households does that support? And then by income level again. And then the affordable housing financing gap is the same as what we'd calculated for the commercial. And then the maximum justifiable fee comes from that. And then again, that comparison. So real quick, these are some estimates of the household income levels required to afford the different types of housing. I'll note that under these single family strong market, that's a larger unit under current market conditions. The moderate market was more lower costs, more typical of what you saw in around 2014, so midway through the recovery. And these are significantly high incomes. They're not considering potential rental income or something like that. It's what income would be required if you were just purchasing that house to occupy as your primary residence. This table summarizes the affordable housing unit need associated with the different housing types. And so these numbers here are per 100 units, so it's something like a 100-unit subdivision. And this is just the extremely low, very low, low, and moderate income. It does not include the above moderate income. We're assuming they can afford market rate units. On the affordable housing financing gap, again, you saw this before, the same calculations there. Maximum justifiable fees based on that nexus. You can see down in the lower level here, converted on a per square foot basis, range between $10.19 a square foot and $5.31 a square foot, depending on the unit type. Okay, comparison again between the maximum justifiable and maximum feasible. In this case, the constraining factor is the maximum feasible fees as opposed to the maximum justifiable in the hotel. And so you can see the numbers that we came up with here around this level. And again, for these single families, those are both assuming a custom home build-to-suit type of unit as opposed to, say, a standard subdivision that might be sold using brokers and so forth, which would add some additional costs to the developer's pro forma. Townhome moderate, again, would be representative of a more modest price scenario, similar to what you had in 2014, where townhome strong is the higher prices you're seeing right now. So it's illustrating the range that you could get as economic conditions fluctuate.
In terms of the housing market.
Economic conditions change all the time, and so what this study attempts to do is sort of bracket what the economic conditions could be. And so in both phases, BAE modeled economic conditions that were more moderate and representative of the conditions that existed in 2014 versus economic conditions that represent a rapidly increasing housing market, if you will, like we're seeing now.
So yes, thank you, Zachariah. So I was just trying to give you an idea of how sensitive these calculations would be to changes in economic conditions. Here again is just a comparison of a before and after pro forma. This one's for a townhouse project. It's assuming a project in a zone that allows overnight rentals without any kind of assured housing requirements. We're estimating potential return on cost of about 26%. If you add in this $8 per square foot fee amount right there, $634,000, it pushes your return on cost down to 20.5%. That's still within the range of feasibility given market conditions and so forth. So there's an illustration there for how that could play out. Just a few considerations for implementation before we get into Q&A. So again, as we were just discussing, if you're implementing an assured housing policy, many jurisdictions try to build in language in their policies to allow for variations in market conditions over time. You adopt a policy today based on what's happening now, but things could change, so you want to have some flexibility to allow for that kind of fluctuation. Fees per residential unit versus fees per square foot. This is something to think about because you can have unintended consequences if you adopt a fee that's based on a per unit basis. What that does, it gives builders the incentive to try to maximize the size of the units they build so they can spread that fixed costs across a larger housing unit. So if you break it down to fee per square foot, it takes away some of that disincentive to create smaller units, which could be more affordable. And this is on the market rate side of the development. So that's something that we suggest you look at. The policy flexibility. These are complicated. We've modeled a range of prototypes. We will fully acknowledge that we cannot capture every variation and permutation of development feasibility that is out there and that developers will face or builders will face in the coming years. So it's really important that your policy give flexibility for how to comply with the requirements, and this can include options to pay a fee, to include housing units on site, to build affordable units off site, but then also to look at the fact that some projects are going to face unique circumstances. They may not fit the prototype that we analyzed. And so you may need to have some process to say, okay, if your project just doesn't fit in the boxes that we've created, we have a procedure to go ahead and calculate a fee or a requirement on a customized basis based on the characteristics of the project. That flexibility you also want to balance out with considerations of the administrative burden and wanting to make sure that there's some objectivity in terms of how you give that flexibility so that it's not adding a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity into the process as far as what the requirements will be. So with that, I'll go ahead and open it up for questions, and we'll do our best to answer them for you.
you can go back to the slide, is the one where you have between 15 and 30 for the
Okay, this one? No. This one? Okay.
So once again, I think I understand it after I asked that other question. So that's just, that's with the economic model now. So that, okay.
Right. So in a very, okay,
Sorry.
good. Okay, thank you.
Is everyone clear on the difference between maximum justifiable fee versus maximum feasible fee?
No. I thought so.
Sure. Okay. The maximum justifiable fee is the requirement that we can derive from the nexus analysis. So it says that based on the amount of affordable unit demand that's created by the market rate development and the cost to subsidize the number of affordable units, that dollar amount is the maximum that we could justify in a policy like this based on that nexus. The maximum feasible is the maximum amount that theoretically a developer could afford to pay if nexus wasn't a consideration, and they could potentially incorporate that much more cost into their project and still hit their targeted rate of return for economic feasibility.
And you typically choose the lower of the two in order to not violate the legal considerations that go into a policy like this.
So that's going to vary by project type. For the hotel, in this particular example, we're looking for an 8% yield on cost. For the residential development prototypes, the townhouse and the condominium, we're looking for a 20% return on cost. So these are being sold once they're completed to end users. And then for the apartments and single family dwelling units, we're looking for a 15% return on cost on those. And these numbers were based on conversations with local developers and others involved in the real estate industry.
Well, I just wanted to clarify, restaurants fall under retail.
Yes.
Size, I thought I read that the policy would be applied to larger single family. But the size of the unit would matter in terms of the implication of whether or not it would be.
So for residential, are you talking about single family residential units? Yeah. So you have flexibility as legislative bodies to decide the appropriate requirements and which projects to impose on and so forth. For the residential, as I said, the custom home, build-to-suit type of project, we're assuming those are typically larger. We modeled that as a 3,000 square foot unit on average. And so that's an example of maybe a larger unit, more luxury oriented, that you might consider requiring a fee for. On the other hand, the more kind of smaller single family project built on spec, meaning there's no particular end user in mind when it's built, the developer is going to build those and sell them to whoever comes to purchase them when they're done. That was modeled as a 2,250 square foot unit at a more moderate overall cost. And that's something that you might look at and say, well, that's more local workforce oriented than that larger luxury oriented 3,000 square foot home. So you could make some determinations as to which of those types would be appropriate to charge a fee on. I would say, our study talks about applying $1 per square foot to either of those.
One more question. There was the use of 172,000 as a unit cost.
Mhm.
Was that an average unit cost? And where's the source for that?
So that was a buildup that we did for creating an affordable housing project. These would be multifamily rental units, 2-bedroom. We collected development costs and built up to that 172,000 per unit average cost.
So in your justifiable part of it here, you have a trying to estimate worker households by income category, and you use the term moderate a lot, below moderate, above moderate, and so forth. Is moderate 50% of AMI? What is moderate?
So moderate is going to be households that are between 80 and 120% of AMI. And when we talk about moderate, we're actually, in these calculations, we're looking at the upper end, people that are at that 120% of AMI.
Well, then my question is, looks like one of the quibbles I would have, you created this giant database with 7 other counties, which might look good on paper, but those other counties typically aren't very much like us. They're heavily a recreation thing, whereas Emory County, for example, is heavily oil and gas, and so much Uinta and so on. But I was struck, all right, by the percent of your take your 60,000 square foot hotel with 42 jobs, and of those total number of jobs,
I'll see if I can get back
42
to
jobs, more than half of them, the typical household, above moderate household, you selected was, I mean, more than half the jobs, people that would buy things are already above income. In other words, it doesn't really, the distribution doesn't look very poor to me. I mean, it looks like these people are above median incomes.
Wasn't that 2 income houses though we were using for the PUF?
Right, and this is allowing for the fact that you can have more than 1 worker per housing unit. So we go from 42 workers to then this number of households, which is around, I believe, 24. And so then of those households, a little bit more than half are going to be at your extremely low to moderate income level. They get sums up to about 13. And then the other half is in the above moderate. And so that is allowing for the fact that some people who work in a hospitality establishment are in a household with another person who has a different income from another source. And some of those are high enough in order to get them above that moderate income threshold.
Okay. Well, in my opinion, I know very little, so forgive me, Matt, but the business, trying to equate our typical distribution here to other counties in the mix is a little bit dicey, all right? Because I can see in Uinta County, for example, where a guy might have a relatively good paying oil and gas job, it makes his household income look pretty good. Meanwhile, we're trying to provide housing for his wife, for example, who's working as a maid at a hotel kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate that comment, and maybe just to dig in just a little deeper, the reason we have that larger area is that's the PUMA, as you mentioned, and that is the minimum size of area within which we can get this very detailed data of occupation and household income by size and so forth. So admittedly, a situation like what you're describing is applying in the larger area that we have to pull that data from, we may be understating to some extent the need that's created within this county when this kind of hotel development gets created. We have to do that because it gives us the quantitative basis. The good news is we're comfortable that we're being conservative in that, and so that to the extent that there was some sort of a challenge to this, we wouldn't be accused of overstating the need and therefore overstating the justifiable fee level and so forth. So we're dealing with some imperfection there, but we think it gives you a starting point that is conservative and defensible should you decide to go forward.
One final question, then I promise I'm going to stop. So this is great. I'm looking ahead to what our ordinances are going to look like. All right, and you very concisely pointed out the trade-off here. We could make the ordinances very simple on paper, so to speak, and not necessarily adaptable. And we could attempt to write, conversely, we could try to write very generalized formulas into them, try to automatically accommodate, if you will, somehow magically calculate the strength of the economy in a quantitative fashion that people would agree on. And every year the numbers would change automatically and everybody would be happy. But so you guys must have done this, right, for other people? Are there some sort of any guidance there? And
Sure.
Other jurisdictions that have already done this that we could start with code? Yeah.
Sure. There are a lot of jurisdictions that have done this, and we can maybe provide staff with some suggestions on some good models for you. My recommendation is that you try to balance this out. You start out with setting a set of fees or requirements that's based on your initial judgment as to what's appropriate now, given economic conditions, the finding of this analysis, what you think makes sense from a community development standpoint as well as economic development standpoint, and that be the baseline requirement, so that people can look at that and say, okay, if I come in and I want to do a project that fits in one of these boxes, this is what I'm needing to plan for. One of the things that, obviously many builders do not welcome this or seek to have this kind of requirement, but what we hear over and over is, we understand the need, we just want to know with predictability what our requirements are so we can plan accordingly, purchase land and so forth. So that's important. But then within that basic structure, to provide some kind of clauses that will allow you to revisit, again, as I mentioned, a project that just doesn't fit into those boxes, a project that has very unique circumstances that won't allow it to even hit a market rate of return under a baseline scenario or what have you, so that there's a way to kind of step aside. So a straightforward project comes in, it goes under those standard requirements, it's simple for everybody, and you're good to go. But then if there's one that's really unique, truly doesn't fit into those boxes, then there's some ability to make some modifications and accommodations to make that project work.
So can I just add one more thought to that? One way this could appear in a policy, should the city or the county councils decide to go this direction, is that the policy would include language that said, if a developer felt that they could present, quantitative evidence that they needed a different fee structure, then they would have that ability to present that. Of course, the burden of proof would be on the developer. The city or the county would have, the right to run that by a third-party analyst. And then, of course, Matt already talked about the various compliance alternatives, such as paying the fee, building the units on-site or off-site, potential land dedication. So those are, I think, some really tangible, areas of flexibility that can be built into the policy.
Yes, Ron?
This might have an obvious answer, but I figure you work with a lot of different communities, and I don't know how often that's been with a city and a county at the same time, but we're both going to be working on policies, and I guess one of the first logical questions that occur to you is, should our policies be similar? What are the pros and cons of that, and will that just become evident as we start working on it, or I was just curious if you had any lessons learned there about?
Sure. A good example of where we're working in a community somewhat like yours, the town of Truckee up in the Lake Tahoe area, and then Placer County surrounds the town. They try to have some similar requirements in those two areas, particularly in the area of the county that's near the town of Truckee in that northern end. So they do make some effort to try to have some alignment. I think the benefit of having comparable structures is that you don't create an incentive for somebody to just jump across the county line, or to a different jurisdiction in order to maybe get the same economic benefits from doing the development, but to have a lesser requirement. So to the extent that you can align those, that's probably desirable.
It also creates continuity for developers across the jurisdictions, clarity, predictability, especially as municipal boundaries change through annexation. So.
So looking at the pro formas in your phase one, it seemed like there were some assumptions made that, for example, that single-family detached would be on an acre, and much development is happening as the higher densities, and I anticipate that in the city that will especially be true. Did you play around with a bunch of scenarios that you didn't necessarily include in the reports that, to try to figure out what was represented or how much variation there might be?
Right. Unfortunately, we couldn't do a whole lot of variations there, so we didn't do other, say, assumptions about different lot sizes and so forth. We tried to pick a prototype that was representative of most of the type of new development that's occurring within either the city or the county. So those were our best guesses at that.
And so that came out of recent building permit data. And of course, there is development occurring on smaller lots in the city and in the county, but because of current zoning, the majority of lots that are available and developable are on 1 acre lots and certainly half-acre or larger lots. But of course, the numbers would change using smaller lots and smaller building sizes.
How many assured housing policies has your firm originated, roughly?
Gosh, I would say, and this is just a rough estimate because I haven't actually counted them up, but we've probably supported creation of a dozen or so of these in various flavors and forms.
And there are over 700 across the country in place in some form or fashion.
Okay. Assuming that you track those, do you have an idea of how many have been litigated, if any?
I'm not directly aware of any that have been litigated. In a lot of ours have been in California, where there's been a pretty long history of what the requirements are and what the legal standards are. So there hasn't been a huge issue with that. So yeah, we certainly haven't been called into court to testify on any of the ones that we've supported.
So you mentioned that the burden of proof from the developers would fall onto, I mean, who would the developers be dealing with? Is it the planning department to prove that they wouldn't be making the profitability off their projects? Or, I mean, who's that person on the ground that's going to be dealing with those numbers?
I think the policy would say that if a builder felt that they were not able to feasibly comply with those requirements, they would submit their information to the planning department, and then that would be reviewed at a staff level. If staff felt they were able to make a fair judgment on that, that could be recommended to the city council or the county council, or if there was a need for additional analysis support, then as Zachariah mentioned, you could get a third party to provide some expert opinion on that.
But I would think that ultimately any exceptions to the policy would have to be approved by council action.
And then also in the report it said that this has been in the works for close to 2 years, and that developers would not be unaware of this being implemented. Once in the
So those discussions, as I understand it, have been happening here in the area for roughly that amount of time. And so there's some awareness that this is an issue that's under consideration. Certainly no formal requirements have been announced. I think that's what this study is a part of, kind of work through that. But this is not a new concept as I understand it here.
I can give a little bit more context to that. In November of 2016, the County Planning Commission formally voted to recommend approval of of an initial version of an assured housing policy that had a residential component and a commercial component. And when it made its way to the county council, legal review from outside legal counsel through the county attorney's office said, if you want to enact a policy of this nature, you need to conduct this two-phase economic study in order to rise above any sort of legal challenges. And in the meantime, if you'd like to initiate an incentive or voluntary approach to this program, then the legal litmus test is much lower. And so the county council gave our department the directive to work on that incentive-based approach while they agreed to fund, in conjunction with the city, these economic studies. And so these studies are the product of that sort of initial legal review. Well, we haven't formally approved, on the county side we're talking, we haven't formally approved the incentive-based approach. We have been working on that for about a year, and we are now holding, we have scheduled public open houses for that incentive-based approach. We're calling it high-density housing overlays. So we have been working on that based on the council directive, and these studies are happening in parallel. So you'll see more information on that approach coming your way soon.
Any questions? Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, so, Mayor Neathouse typically likes to take a temperature of the room.
It's cold in here.
They're just really curious as what the county is thinking, that they'd like to think.
Would this be a good opportunity to have different council members express, where they are in the thinking process? Do they need some studies? Are they excited to move forward in developing some ordinances? Or is this just something they're uncomfortable with? Is that what you want?
Yes.
Well, I can start by saying this gives us the opportunity to have that fact-based conversation about affordable housing so that we can put our emotions and our personal situations, housing situations to the side, understand this data, and then apply it to policies. I'm grateful that both councils have now passed a resolution basically saying, let's see what this says, and then let's take the right action based on the recommendations. I'm incredibly grateful that we did that step and that we've done that together. And so now, I'm encouraged that we work together to have a unified value approach as we develop these policies. I'd like to include San Juan County in this conversation as well. In terms of temperature, there are so many details to figure out, and I'm encouraged that we've got really great staff in both the city and the county to be able to bring to us policy recommendations. But to me, the most important thing is that we move together unified. And so my question is with this data, are we set to move together as a unified group, between our two councils?
I am.
Okay.
Next, I'm gonna watch John Wayne movie.
All right. So I think that's a good question, and I think, really to me, we have accumulated and acquired some good data, but I think really the proof's in the pudding in exactly how do we dial in their policy. So when we have a policy in front of us, we have to make those decisions. I think this can be a helpful tool to address the issue.
one of the things that I've always been interested in the event that a commercial development or a development doesn't, because of the formula, how it's set forth in the policy, if they don't build the housing and they make that payment in lieu of development, what does that look like? You know, how do we see the city and the county utilizing that capital to get units on the inventory? Because there's a lot of ways that can go. So that's a bulk of the conversation. I don't want to get, obviously we can't get too far out ahead of ourselves, but I think that's a really important conversation to have. Yeah, and there may be some debates there, or just some really good meetings and work to get on the same page as far as what we think is appropriate. But I've enhanced some of my perspectives on this since we started a year ago. I want to make sure that we're doing, picking some of the lower hanging fruit to address the issue. The incentives is an approach I like, but some of the findings from phase 1, increased density is still not going to close the gap in some aspects enough to deliver that product. So I don't, in my opinion, it's not the cure-all. I do think it's fair and appropriate. We've hit a threshold for some of these large developments to help pull us out of this hole that we're in. But I look forward to putting the policy together and having those discussions.
So that'll be yay.
That's yeah.
Qualified.
That's not a yes or no, that's a how we're gonna do it.
Yeah,
I like that.
It's even more than we've done. Rory?
I would agree with Curtis and we too. I think we need to, I really want to work together in this place. So I'm excited to work with this.
Tree?
Same.
Patrick?
Yeah, I agree with all the comments. Well, I'm Tom. I really appreciate all the work and professionalism that you've brought to this. It's sort of reformed my view of what our shared housing policy would be, coming at it from the E first, as opposed to doing a sort of a percentage of units in residential. And so thinking about it in that respect has been really helpful, and doing it on a square foot basis instead of a per unit basis, that seems to solve. I'm just very encouraged by the different ideas that have been generated so far, as well as just the pro formas in phase 1. There's a lot of very interesting information about the nature of development. So I think we've got a lot of good information to move forward in developing specific policies that really work for our community.
And I'm glad he said it, because I'm afraid to say it, but I am very excited. The hot comment. I'm very excited to move forward cautiously, and really happy to have this excellent, high-quality information and work with the city council and the city staff. And we do have great staff in both organizations, so it's exciting to.
And I too appreciate the work and professionalism that's gone into this. This is good information. I'm not going to say I'm hot, because it takes a whole lot more than that to excite me anymore.
Now she's really
Her face ledges are It was very inappropriate, wasn't it? No. I think it's high time that we got together and worked on this and made sure that we were working for a united goal.
I agree with Curtis. This isn't the be-all, end-all, but it is a tool, and it's time that we use one of our tools in our belts. So, and it's encouraging to see that the profitability for for hoteliers and condos and townhomes, that it's the justifiable and the feasible percentages are not too far off from each other, so that's not gonna be that difficult, so. Oh, good.
Ron? I'll spare you guys the 15-minute lecture that I gave on the benefits of assured housing at our council meeting on May 22nd. You can go back to the video and watch that if you'd like. I would encourage anyone who has questions about different ways inclusionary housing has been put into play in the U.S. To check out the website inclusionaryhousing.org, just because it addresses a lot of the common questions that people have about inclusionary housing, and I found it very useful when I was reading the report, but also studying some of those issues.
All right. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well. I'm constantly reminded of how tough a nut this is to crack. I remember I was sitting on the County Planning Commission years ago when Zachariah first introduced all this to me, and I remember thinking how many difficulties there were in fighting really a private sector market for which we all are participants in as well as complainers about. So I think it's a great step in the right direction, and as a retired engineer who knows that everything always takes longer, I think I'd like to make us identify real people to really champion all this, our planning staff together with the county's planning staff, and get this going, because I'm sure we will argue to the ends of the earth. And we need to hear from the development community too, because they're the ones that's going to be affected. Yeah. So let's do it.
Thank you. I'm reflecting back on, when I first came on the council, and it's been for years, everybody talks about assured housing and affordable housing being an issue when they run and such. I just want to thank Chris Barrett in the audience, because he was the one that during our first budget meeting said, money talks. We've got to put money into developing an assured housing program. We need to have a line item in our budget to deal with this. And it's right. And since we have made that a priority, I've seen more movement towards addressing our affordable housing needs than we have in years past. So thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. And, so I'm excited, and I want to not take I want to get busy. Pencil and paper, and start going. Yes.
A comment, maybe even a question for the presenter, but I'm thinking about the Harvard study in the 18-year real estate market cycle, if you buy into that. It's hard not to when it's on accurate, but talking about that study, if people don't know about it, it talks about an 18-year highs and lows that's very predictable historically on our markets, and at certain points in that study, there's expansion and builders build because there's conditions that make them want to build, and then there's other points where builders won't build because the conditions, profitability are not there, and 2024 would be perhaps another bottom according to that, and so more impetus to move quickly while we're still in an expansion. Of course, Moab's a little bit of a different bubble, but 2024, that's when things could get near the bottom out, or get some sort of bottom. I don't know what you want to comment on that, but
yeah, I would just say that the one thing we know is that there are going to be these fluctuations. We don't know the exact timing, and as you mentioned, here you have some sort of fundamentals that are driving your real estate market. They're a little bit different than the U.S. economy as a whole. But this is something that I think probably every jurisdiction that establishes these types of requirements grapples with. And at least the partial answer to that is periodic updates to the studies and their analyses and so forth. So revisiting what the conditions are. Some places, particularly during the Great Recession, did temporary suspension of their policies. I mentioned Truckee. They just were reinstating their workforce housing requirements on commercial development last week because they'd held off on that for a while. And they said, we want to try to encourage economic development. Let's lower the bar in terms of feasibility. And so let's suspend those requirements. And then they had a tiered ramp up. And then just last week, the council voted to increase to their full implementation. So, keeping that sort of thing in mind and just expecting that you're going to have those kinds of needs over time to face, I think is, part of the reality of this kind of program.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Thank you very much. I understood it a lot better after doing the presentation than after reading it.
Good. I didn't confuse. Thank you very much.
Okay, we will move on to item C, need for multi-agency funding of the part-time watershed coordinator position for the community. Zachariah Levine, community.
Okay, Arnie's still here, so I may draw him into the conversation as well. But we have been approached by Mike Allred from the State Division of Water Quality. Arnie?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Water quality?
Division of Water Quality.
Yeah. And he has basically come to the county, and I believe he may have spoken to folks at the city as well, and has requested some cost matching from our local jurisdictions to help fund the watershed coordinator position. And that position is currently filled by Arnie Holtquist, and I can let Arnie talk a little bit more about what that position involves. One of the very important responsibilities of that position is chairing the Moab Area Watershed Partnership, which is a coalition of individuals representing a range of entities as well as citizen groups, and that group helps to just review the sort of water conditions in the valley and then identifies research projects that Arnie implements. Much of it is funded through grants, so we leverage that position incredibly in the area, and I think that the folks who participate in the Watershed Partnership gain a lot from it. They have contributed to our local understanding of water and our planning for water in the future by developing a watershed plan. And so I'll let Arnie talk a little bit more about the position and about the request, and maybe you can talk a little bit about the funding levels. But I would just say, as the staff liaison to the watershed, or to the MOP, the Moab Area Watershed Partnership, I see a lot of value in that group, and so I am happy to have the city and the county converse a little bit about continuing the position, because it sounds like there is some threat that the position will go away if we don't step up. We haven't been given a specific amount, but I would guess it's not onerous by any means. So.
I hate to start with an apology, but there was supposed to be something in your packets about my position, but apparently it in the packet I saw it didn't make it there. Was it in your packet? You didn't see it. I didn't think you did. So my apologies, it didn't get there. Second thing, I shouldn't actually be talking to you. Mike Allred should be talking to you today. Unfortunately, he was unable to obtain transportation down here. So it's DDWQ's position. It may be a position that I am currently inhabiting, so to speak, but they actually asked me to fulfill the position. I'm not sure that the position won't go away with me leaving, and I am planning on staying a little while because I promised Mike at this point in time. Either way, the three biggest parts of this position are administering the MOP, as he spoke of, and I facilitate management of grants that we get. We've got $200,000 to $300,000 in the last 4 years. The position's been around for 7 years. And I monitor the water qualities of Mill and Pack Creek on a regular basis, as well as groundwater. That takes about 30% of my time. So when I'm speaking casually and people ask me what I do, I basically tell them I take care of the water, I facilitate grants, and I keep everybody talking to each other. That's basically what's involved with the job, okay? And DWQ, this position will not go away. I don't really feel there's a threat to it at this point in time. What I understand is coming is that when they originated this position 7 years ago, they were hoping that the stakeholders involved could somehow pony up some money to help compensate for the position. At this point in time, the BLM is going to come up with $2,500. They're just waiting for somebody to sign the check too. The town of Castle Valley is considering paying some too. Mike's spoken with them. So it's up to you guys what you want to do. The position at this point in time, part-time, they have it at $35,000 a year is what the actual position costs the state. So, with that being said, are there any other questions on that?
How much are they talking about?
So I asked Mike that he ought to give you guys a little more idea about that. If the position was 50% funded by stakeholders, they would be overwhelmed, overjoyed at this point in time. So, like I said, the BLM's put in $2,500. If you're asking me for an idea, I'm not quite sure what to say at that point in time. If the city was $5 and the county was $250, and then Castle Valley put in another $250, we're close to having the position 50% funded by stakeholders. We don't need to go that far if you guys can't afford it. Mike was just hoping more to show the people in the field. I think really what he wants to see is some buy-in from the community so we can justify this position continuing on into the future. Okay, so any monetary amount I'm sure will be welcome.
Yeah, so Arnie, correct me if I'm wrong. What I learned when you and Mike were talking in the MOPS meeting, doesn't he go around all around the southeast part of the state and check gauges and water qualities? So you might describe a little bit about what he actually does day in and day out.
Mike Walbett?
Yeah.
His position is similar to mine. It's just that he works in the state office building and has the entire southeastern Utah as well as the Bear River corridor. Whereas I'm focused in Grand and San Juan.
I understand that, but it's Mike's position we're talking about here? Is that
No, it's the position that's funded. I'm funded on grants through them.
Sure.
Actually, I'm funded on grants through them on a revolving non-point source grant. And what Mike is hoping for is some buy-in from stakeholders to help augment those grants.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Have you talked to San Juan County?
I have not talked to San Juan County. I have been working down there. I've got some grants down there, and I work with them on their watershed management plan, which they do have at this point in time.
Arnie, do you, off the top of your head, know how much money we have received in our area for water quality projects?
In Grand County, we're between $200,000 and $300,000 at this point in time in the last year. I've also received some grants from San Juan County too.
So what about some examples of what that money was used for?
So Rim to Rim has received 2 different grants, and they've done revegetation on several properties in town through the Mill Creek and Pack Creek area. The BLM received a $40,000 grant where they worked on the Mill Creek Phase 1 project, and the next one will be the Phase 3 project, where they have revegetated and removed Russian olives, as well as done social trail work in the Mill Creek area, which we're all familiar with, I'm sure. And we did the Wagner Street project with the city, and that was $36,000, where there was some material in the floodplain. How it got there, there was a lot of finger pointing between the entities, and we solved it by saying, you guys, you don't have to pay for it, we'll get a grant for it. There's a concentrated animal feedlot that we'd still be doing at this point in time. That was a $40,000 project also. There's also been some minor information and education projects that I don't necessarily need to go into at this point in time.
So it sounds like we're getting a good return out on it.
It's the position that you're looking at, not me, please.
But it's supporting some local employment.
Yeah, well, that.
I mean, in addition to the watershed, it is a form of economic development.
It is, yeah.
Do you want a staff recommendation for what it's worth in terms of what the county could put in?
Yeah.
City as well, I think that, you could say BLM's putting in $2,500, why don't the city and county each put that in? It's maybe a little bit less than the 50% match, but because we haven't been given a specific dollar amount, my
questions for me?
Do you guys have an idea of who you'd like to replacement?
For me? So Mike, I'm older. I am older. I'm semi-retired at this point in time. And Mike is reaching that stage also. I promised Mike I'd stay with him till he retired, and that's at least 2.5 years away. Okay? So I'm planning on staying, but I really want you to consider the position, not necessarily the work that I do. That's me in terms of, if the job goes away, I will be okay. They ask me to do jobs.
So how do we move forward with this? When we do it at our respective meetings? Okay.
Have that action item on our next meeting.
I think we also need to consider that San Juan is part of this. Okay? Let's not leave them out.
So if you'd like me to take that message to Mike Allred, I'd be glad to take that message to Mike Allred and let him do the footwork on that. Okay? And I'll have him get back to you too.
Okay.
That actually should be his job at this point in time.
Do you need some sort of just formal letter from each of the entities saying we commit to this?
At this point in time, an email to Mike would probably work just fine.
Thank you, Marty.
Thank you all. It was great to engage you all together today. It was a great conversation tonight too. Thank you all for your service.
Thank you.
City and county are working together.
Okay, now we are on last item, our D, future joint meeting dates. Emily.
This was great, let's do it again. Let's say what we want to talk about, and then let's talk about it. I really am encouraged by joint meetings. I think it's worth it, because we've got a lot of things to talk about, housing, water, and how we're talking about infrastructure development between our two councils. So, if we'd like to, I know that we all have the dates on as tentative on our calendars. The next one being tentative.
I don't think we have any more sensitive dates.
We don't.
We
The rest
set
of
it
the
out,
year.
because we decided.
Well,
not
we used to do
the fifth Tuesday, we decided.
Or fifth Friday.
Or fifth Friday, everybody likes that. Because nothing's scheduled in with the other, so it's kind of like we didn't, and I liked the idea, I thought it was okay to get.
Isn't there a calendar that we have looked at the beginning of this year that listed tentative dates throughout the 2018?
Yes, I believe as soon as we sort of settled on that, and there was talk about not doing those. So I think it's totally okay.
How often, let's start with that, how often do you think we should be together?
As often as we have good stuff to talk about.
Agreed. So do we, maybe we should put the future into consideration? We're looking at interlocal agreement, water and shared infrastructure development, middle possibility of the future. Considerations. Do we want to look at it again a month? And put the tentative date, and then if there's nothing, that we need to really discuss or do together, then we can always cancel it. But I think they need to get it on the calendar and get close, so, there's really nothing for the two bodies to get together. But then, if there is, then it's on your schedule.
I'd love to put a date on the calendar for another joint meeting. Let's see what topics arise. If there really isn't need for us to get together, then we cancel it and go to dinner. Not together, unless we want to. Then we'll do it.
We're going, we're having dinner at a new restaurant.
2 months, the city council has a regularly scheduled meeting on 14th of August. You want to trade back and forth that way, maybe? 2 months out?
I think so. So should we kind of sit on, see, we have planning commission that time. That's work, at 5. But we will always have planning commission during that meeting. That's true. So, you know.
So we could reserve for August 14th at 6 p.m. an hour, pre-council workshop, joint meeting with pre-council, county council. If all y'all are interested in that, then let's tentatively set that date. And then in the meantime, we can talk to each other and see if there's another topic other than housing that brings us together. Karen?
Can I just, and this is totally inappropriate, I'm sure, but it's timely. If, I was just kind of curious what everyone, how they're feeling about potentially having stricter fire restrictions in county and city-wide.
In the county, they're not allowed. We're pretty lucky. They're not allowed on residential, private, or,
You're right, it's technically inappropriate because it's not on the agenda.
I know, but it's just so timely.
Yeah, the county.
It wouldn't be timely to discuss it before it's all
Expired.
Well, then we're too late.
I don't think we can get any more strict. Is that what my understanding? Yeah.
It's pretty much bad.
The only thing we've got left is our big shell.
That's it.
That has never, my husband's on the fire department for 33 years, that many, 4th of July T-Dest was that, he was out by flowers, not one was ever started by professionals, it was all started by, home.
Kids.
Or adults.
Adults.
Adults, and so, I'm not worried about professionals, because we have, they have fire truck up there, they, so, but yeah, there won't be any personal fires.
I got a question. Emily, I guess I don't, stop me if this is not appropriate in the point of view. As far as the shared housing stuff is going, can we right now make a recommendation to request staff to get our planning staff to answer some of the basic first order questions, perhaps retrieve from that sample code, for example, from other jurisdictions? I mean, some way to get started. I mean, I just don't want to have another meeting a couple months away and we're right where we are today.
Yeah, David, was that pretty clear?
Yeah, pretty clear? Is that clear? But the ordinances are going. Sure.
Oh, sure, yes.
I hope that was clear.
We don't need to do anything formal. He's got.
Okay.
Can I just make sure that, so we're tentatively saying the next joint meeting, Tuesday, August 14th, 6 o'clock for about an hour. We're assuming we're gonna have some kind of topics, as you mentioned, housing, water, infrastructure development, I don't know, right? We'll get that together. My only concern is if with housing, with Zachariah being away at planning commission meeting, we might put housing later on in the agenda, or maybe if we weren't for you to be there, I don't know. Because housing is the thing that's been a standing agenda item for 3 years. So, just wanted to make
Well, I
something
think
workable.
that honestly, Ruth, I think that's gonna be the easiest for our council. Yeah, so we'll figure that out. Okay, sir.
One quick comment. I just wanted to thank the city again for your leadership in response to the fire, organizing these activities the day after. It was impressive to see how quick you guys respond and mobilize. I really appreciate it.
We already have 2 future considerations to put on
three bases.
Motion to adjourn.
Second?
Second.
Motion by Curtis Will, second by Greg Holiday. All in favor?
Aye.
Go for it.
You guys want to stick around for a public hearing?
Now? What kind of snacks do you want? You can't stay for a full session, I'm sorry.
Thanks.
I talked to John today. John today.
They have had a better memory.
Yeah.
He said $600 for his beaver hat.
That's what Shannon said he paid for it.
That's a lot of money for a hat.
All right, thank you.
You're around.
But then the Maverick can get a big one.
Yeah, I apologize. I guess 6:15 was a little early.
It just went off, it's all great.
We did. It was great. Stage. Not yet.
The city production paper.
Well, they haven't, or that,
What's that?
that's your take report.
Is it going?
Probably.
Zachary, you wanna grab the city's tape recorder? Is that what it is?
Do I want to grab it?
No?
It's all right, they can record our meeting.
Responsibility.
Hey, why do we have notice? No, okay. Okay. We are reopening the county council June 19th regular meeting. It's after 6 p.m., so we are opening the public hearings, possible action items. We are present. Curtis Wells has stepped out, but we have Greg Halliday, Jalen Hawks, Mary McGann, Rory Paxman, Patrick Trim, Ruth Dillon, and Diana Carroll. So, public hearing, the first public hearing is public hearing for public comment on a proposed ordinance as approving the rezone of 1.35 acres of land located at 1146 South, Highway 191, from rural residential to highway commercial. Zachariah.
Okay, so this is a split zone property. We've got a number of these in the highway corridor where one parcel has two zoning designations on it. In this case, the land owned by Joyce Robertson from the Robertson Trust on the highway. You probably know it as the Arches Auto Repair area. There's a coffee shop, drive-through coffee shop, and now a lunch stop on the front end of the property. That property is about 3.5 acres, and approximately 1 1/3 acres is zoned rural residential. That's the sort of western back end of the property, and about 2 acres is currently zoned highway commercial. That split zone does actually bisect one of the buildings on the property, which is always an interesting situation. We see it elsewhere. And the property owner is requesting that the rural residential portion of their property be rezoned to highway commercial. And the impetus for this request is that the house located on the property in the rural residential area had been used as a long-term rental, and the owner, for a variety of reasons that are maybe immaterial to this conversation, would like to utilize that property for short-term rentals. And in order to do that, the property would need to be of a different zoning designation than rural residential, where we do not allow that use. So the property has all of the utilities in place, and commercial activity has existed on the property, at least in the highway commercial zone, for many, many years. It's got water rights from a spring and shares from Pat Creek are attached to the parcel, but all of the utilities are provided. So staff sees a number of justifications that support the rezone, in particular the fact that it is in the highway corridor, and that the future land use plan map in our general plan, although it does show a similar split zone, that was really a function of, I think, a lack of granularity in the assessment of what's there and what the city and the county would want there. When we presented this application to the Planning Commission, it was postponed initially, and then ultimately the Planning Commission voted to send an unfavorable recommendation for the rezone. So they did not vote to support the rezone request, but as is allowed by our code and by state code, the applicant has the right and has selected to exercise that right to bring the rezone request to the county council. We have not received any public comment on it. We didn't receive any public comment on it at the Planning Commission. And in the agenda summary in your report, there are some justifications for the way that the Planning Commission voted. So I'm not going to go through the full staff report. I can answer questions specifically as needed. We do have the property owner here, and as is always the case, that the property owner is welcome to address the council, but otherwise I'm available for questions. And of course, if there's anyone here from the public that wants to speak, that is also allowed.
What was the vote? Was it a unanimous vote?
No, it was 3-2.
3-2.
They require 4 affirmative votes, just as you all do.
Because they have 7, so 3-2.
Well, it's not because of that, it's because it's in their bylaws that way. Excuse me.
The vote was 3-2 against it.
Oh.
So it was
excuse
far
me.
from passing.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
This is a public hearing. I did know that someone was here earlier that wanted to speak, but I don't see them now. They told me that they were coming back. They were here, maybe they'll be stepping in. Would the owners like to address the council?
What we'd like to do
And
is
just
make
make sure to come up here and state your name.
My name is Joyce Robertson. We have that property on the highway. We're just trying to make it so that the residential, we can put it into commercial. We're making a nightly rental out of it. It has lots of parking for the people, for Jeeps and things like that they want to do to get it off the highway, as I know. If it ever, at one time, we don't want to sell it right now, but at one time, if they ever do sell it, or we pass away, they do sell it, they're going to make it into a parking lot anyway if they have a motel there. So it's just, as you can, I don't know if you've got the map though, it's about a half acre. It's all going up into the hills. It's about 30 foot from the level up into the mountains here. Half of it is J.J. Wong's up into that part. It's our property and all the way around it. Also, it has a spring on it that comes out that we gave right away for the Hollyoaks so they could get the spring water and use that water. We gave it to them so we can't build right close to that water that goes right to the bottom of the hill. Probably build about 5 feet around that house.
Question? Council have any questions?
This is the house, the old house that's behind Wicked Root, right?
Yes.
It's a commercial area.
Pardon?
The area is a very commercial area.
Yes, in the front.
So the planning, well, I'm sorry, I don't want to interject additional questions for Ms. Roberts.
Any further
And
questions?
the Arches auto repair is there.
Yes.
The Arches auto repair is there.
Yes, and half of that shop is in the residential and half of it is in the commercial. So if you change it over, all of it is commercial. It's been that way since forever, but since we moved here, yes. 69.
Zachariah, what was your comment?
I just wanted to suggest, I wanted to provide a little bit more context to the conversation that took place at the Planning Commission and staff's recommendation. I think that, our perspective is similar to Councilman Wells in that the area has a commercial feel to it. There's a commercial character to the area. Although, I will note that it is bordered by residential zone land on its western borders, and so the Planning Commission did take that into consideration. I'd like to just note that I think the Planning Commission is often trying to consider when we have conversions from residential to commercial, what the impact of that is on our, larger housing market. And in this particular instance, I think everybody recognized that you couldn't add more housing to that parcel in that area right now because the rural residential limits development to 1 unit per acre. And so in thinking about the implications of retaining the rural residential zoning on there, I would just note that you're not going to see more housing on there. Of course, it could potentially preserve housing for someone occupying that existing unit, but the only way that it could become, developable at a greater level is if, zoning densities change, or if you adopt the proposed high-density housing overlays that would incentivize. It is included in that overlay, but of course that isn't on the books yet. And so I just want to try to give you the bigger context of, the existing zoning, what's possible there now, and, what could be possible there, either if zoning stays the way it is, or if an overlay possibility becomes, at play. So.
I feel bad to someone was here too long. I gave up. Okay, this is a public hearing. Is there anybody else? Oh, go. I'm sorry, I didn't see.
So the Wayne property next door is the split zone as well?
Which property?
Yeah.
One is
To the south, whatever direction that is, at that point on the highway.
Yes, that is also a split zone property. And that's a function of when the first zoning map was established, rather than looking at parcel boundaries, there was a buffer from the highway that was used as the zoning boundary. That issue, we deal with them on a 1-by-1 basis. Typically, we have tried to take a proactive approach to it, but haven't quite settled on the best way to deal with all of the split zone properties.
How many more are there, do you think? in that?
There are quite a few, yeah, all throughout the highway corridor.
Any other public? This is a public hearing. The public hearing will remain open until Wednesday the 27th, correct? Yes. Wednesday the 27th. People can send in emails, call, write, but public comments will be accepted through the 27th at 5 o'clock.
Madam Chair, we're not able to actually do much with calls,
No, you
but
can't.
but writing,
When
yes.
I said that, I went, that was not right. Don't know where that one came from. Yeah, the 27th, email or write, because it needs to be recorded. Phone call doesn't do that. Okay, thank you. So it will stay open until the 27th. Okay, we will move to the next public hearing to hear public comment on a proposed ordinance to adjust the 2018 wages and cost of living for Grand County elected official Chris Baird, budget officer.
All right, so this is an extension of the cost of living adjustment that we discussed a while back for the non-elected employees. Both the council and the elected officials require a public hearing, and separate ones because they're separate ordinances. And so, which one are we starting with, Mary, again?
The first one was the one on just Grand County elected officers.
Okay.
And then it's the council members.
All right, so the Budget Advisory Board recommended favorably a cost of living adjustment for all employees in the county, and left it up to your discretion whether or not that would start retroactive to January or begin the beginning of July. And so the total approximate cost would be $11,364 for all elected officials except the county council. Any questions?
Okay, so this is.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll make a comment. Okay. Several years ago, when we were looking at adjustments for the elected officials, there were council members who voted against it. And I just want to say that this makes way more sense to me this time, because at that time I was opposed to raising elected officials' salaries if we weren't taking care of the staff. We are in the process of doing that. Now we have implemented the cost of living and working through the final stages of the salary survey. And so this feels way better to me than it did last round, which got kind of ugly. So.
Any other comments? Yes.
I think for elected and non-elected, we just have to keep things competitive and incentivized to get involved. And I don't know who said it, but someone said, if you're going to spend money, spend it on people. It shouldn't be easier to get a copier than to get an employee a raise. And that's reality. It's easier to go get a $10,000 copier. So, and it's better to spend on people. So,
I agree.
thank you.
Any other comments? This public hearing will stay open until the 27th at 5 o'clock.
Have you solicited comments from the public, just for the?
I think that's probably a good idea. Do we have any comments from the public? Seeing none, this public hearing will remain open until the 27th of June at 5 o'clock for emails and written comments. Thank you. And now we are on public hearing to hear public comment on the proposed ordinance to adjust the 2018 wages for cost of living for Grand County council members. That's even less than.
Okay, so this is the same as the last one, except we're just amending a different ordinance. This ordinance would actually amend the plan, our plan for government, where the council salary is lives, and it would be approximately $1,600 to do a 2% COLA for council members. That's for the full retroactive,
That's the retroactive.
back to January. And
That's
so,
so weird, so cheap.
Yeah, we are cheaper.
Okay, public comment.
Is it open?
What
Are
was
you
all
opening
that
it?
Andrew said about investing?
Excluding Rory.
We could put another.
We all vote right now.
Okay, this public hearing will remain open until the 27th at 5 o'clock for written comment.
all right, thanks y'all.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Okay, Jalen Hawks.
Make a motion
You bet.
to go into closed session for pending or imminent litigation.
Jalen made the motion. Do we have a second? Seconded by Councilman Halliday. We will go into closed session. Thanks.
You disagree.
And me one, Curtis.